Have you ever noticed that deafening roar that fills your ears the moment everything else goes quiet? It isn't a sound from the outside world. It is the frantic static of a soul terrified of its own company. In this age of perpetual motion and endless streams of information, we have become masters of evasion, architects of intricate fortresses of noise designed to keep one single entity at bay: ourselves. We live in a time where silence has become not just a rarity, but an almost unbearable weight, a pressure we instinctively seek to escape. The instant a conversation ends, the moment the music stops, our hands twitch, reaching for the familiar, cold comfort of a glowing screen. A phone, a song, a video, anything to plug the dam before the deep waters of our own consciousness can breach the surface. This isn't merely a habit, it is a deep-seated fear, a spiritual anxiety disguised as a need for distraction. We are running, but what are we running from? If you feel the truth of this in your bones, if you've ever felt that subtle panic in the quiet, know that you are not alone on this path. This is a sign of your awakening. Let us journey into this silence together. Share your experience in the comments with a simple, "I resonate," and let's affirm for one another that this journey inward is not one of madness, but of profound homecoming. The great philosopher Blaise Pascal once delivered a truth that echoes through the centuries, a truth that now, in our hyper-connected world, strikes with the force of a thunderclap. All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. This observation has never been more piercingly accurate. In a world meticulously engineered to capture and hold our attention, a world that profits from our distraction, silence is no longer a neutral state. It has become an active confrontation. It forces a meeting with the one person we have become experts at avoiding. When there is no external noise, no feed to endlessly scroll through, no voice narrating our thoughts for us, we are left utterly and completely with the raw, unfiltered presence of our own being. And for so many souls in this modern era, that experience feels like staring into a mirror they never asked to see. A mirror that reflects not just the surface self, but the vast, often turbulent, inner landscape we've long suppressed. So we drown it out. We manufacture noise to avoid depth. We fill every available pocket of time with sound and fury, signifying perhaps a deep and collective nothingness. But what if this perception is a grand illusion? What if the void is not a void at all? What if silence isn't an absence, but a profound and sacred presence? What if its perceived emptiness is merely an illusion, a veil hiding its true nature? Consider this. What if silence is, in fact, a gateway, a divinely designed portal, leading not outward into more chaos, but inward into the serene and eternal sanctuary of your higher self? When you dare to step into silence, you begin to notice a shift in your very vibration. Time itself seems to bend and stretch. It slows down in ways the modern, hurried mind finds deeply disorienting, even frightening. We are so conditioned to the frantic rhythm of motion and stimulation that stillness can feel like a system malfunction, an error in the code of our daily existence. But understand this profound truth. Silence does not malfunction. It reveals. It peels back the layers of a lifetime of conditioning. It shows you just how much of your precious inner world, your unique divine essence, has been drowned out by the relentless tide of the external. Think about it. How quickly does discomfort arise when there is no music playing in the background of your life? No comforting buzz of a notification promising a connection, however fleeting. No ongoing chatter, either internal or external, to occupy the mind. That discomfort, that rising wave of anxiety, is not about the world outside. It is a signal, a divine alarm, pointing to the neglected world within. This is the sacred function of silence. It strips away the superficial. It dissolves the constant commentary of the ego, the masks we wear to navigate our roles, the armor we don for protection, to keep ourselves from feeling too much, from being too vulnerable. Silence makes a single, non-negotiable demand: that you face the unvarnished truth of who you are when there is no audience to applaud, no feedback to validate, no performance to maintain. And that is precisely why it is so terrifying for so many, and precisely why it is so essential for your spiritual awakening. In the stark, holy space of silence, we are unshielded, we are exposed. But it is within that very vulnerability that lies the possibility of something truly radical, something the soul deeply yearns for: authenticity. The constant noise has become the default setting of modern life, not just the literal noise of traffic and television, but the mental, emotional, and digital noise that creates a kind of psychological smog. This smog clouds our ability to see ourselves, to see others, and to perceive the divine guidance that is always present. We scroll instead of think. We react instead of reflect. And this constant, frantic engagement gives us the illusion of connection, when in reality, it often deepens our sense of disconnection from our true selves, from each other, and ultimately, from source energy. Silence interrupts this hypnotic loop. To choose silence is an act of profound refusal. It is a quiet, gentle, yet immensely powerful rebellion against a system that profits from our constant attention and our manufactured anxiety. To be silent is to reclaim sacred space. It is to carve out a sanctuary within your own being space, to think deeply, to feel fully, to hear what is usually drowned out by the cacophony of the everyday. And what do we often hear once the noise finally dies down? It isn't always peace, at least not at first. Often, it is the echoes of things we have long suppressed: old wounds, unresolved grief, unspoken truths. But you must understand that listening to them, truly allowing them to be heard without judgment, is where the deepest healing begins. In this age, more than ever, silence has become countercultural. It is no longer just the absence of sound, it is the presence of will. It is choosing to pause when everything and everyone around you demands acceleration. It is choosing not to comment, not to react, not to be perpetually visible in a culture that dangerously equates visibility with worth. Silence becomes a way of being that challenges the default pace of society. It is no longer passive, it becomes an active, conscious choice. And in that choice, it holds a power that noise can never replicate. It holds depth, dignity, a stillness that refuses to be consumed or commodified by the marketplace of attention. Perhaps most importantly, silence becomes a sanctuary, not because it protects us from the world, but because it prepares us to re-enter it more whole, more rooted in our own divine truth, more awake. The quieter we become on the inside, the more we truly begin to hear. And what we hear is not empty, it is essential. It is the language of the universe speaking directly to our soul. This wisdom is ancient, woven into the fabric of the world's most profound spiritual traditions. In the Taoist worldview, for instance, silence is not a void, it is the origin, the uncarved block from which all things arise. The modern world treats silence as a mere pause between meaningful moments, an empty space to be filled. But the sage Lao Tzu saw it as the very ground from which meaning itself emerges. The Tao, the great and ineffable way of nature, is not something to be captured by speech or dissected by reason. It reveals itself in stillness, in the gentle, unspoken flow of what is. To be silent, in this sacred tradition, is not to retreat or withdraw from life. It is to listen, not with the ears, but with your entire presence. It is to align your own frequency with the rhythm of the cosmos, with a mind quiet enough to perceive the subtle truths of existence that noise always drowns out. Lao Tzu warned us with a timeless paradox. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. These words are not meant to shame expression, but to elevate another kind of understanding, the kind that does not need to be announced, but is simply and profoundly felt. Our world thrives on the opposite of this principle. We are trained from birth to speak, to post, to project, to explain ourselves constantly. But in doing so, we often lose the chance to simply be. Silence, in Lao Tzu's philosophy, is not emptiness but alignment. It is the sacred space where the individual self dissolves into the universal flow, not to disappear, but to finally and truly harmonize. True wisdom does not impose. It does not shout from the rooftops. It watches with the patience of a mountain and moves with the effortless grace of a river. When we are silent, not just outwardly but inwardly, we create room for the Tao to enter. This happens not through strenuous effort, but through a gentle surrender. It is the letting go of the ego's incessant need to be heard, to be affirmed, to be right. And in that sacred letting go, something truly remarkable happens. Clarity arises without needing explanation. This clarity is not mental. It is not a concept. It is existential. It is a felt sense of being. In the temple of silence, we stop wrestling with life and we begin moving with it. The Tao ceases to be a distant mystery and becomes a living rhythm, a pulse we can feel in our own hearts when we finally stop trying to control everything. The modern obsession with articulation, with naming and categorizing every experience, builds an invisible wall between us and life itself. Silence lovingly tears down that wall. It allows life to reach us unfiltered, without the layers of commentary and ego. In silence, we perceive not only the world more clearly, but ourselves. The mind quiets, not because it is forced into submission, but because it finally feels safe enough to rest. And from that deep, sacred rest, a deeper kind of knowing emerges, a knowing that doesn't need proof, a knowing that simply is. To embrace silence in the Tao's sense is not to abandon the world. It is to merge with its deeper current. Lao Tzu's silence is not passive, but deeply, vibrantly alive. It contains the wisdom of mountains, the patience of seasons, the compassion of rivers that carve through solid stone without ever raising their voice. And this silence is accessible to all of us. Not through status or education or eloquent speech, but through simple presence. It is accessed through the radical act of not needing to add anything to the moment. Imagine what it means to live that way. To meet life not with argument, but with openness. To carry silence not as an absence, but as a precious gift. In a world obsessed with saying more, the one who speaks less and listens more becomes the true revolutionary. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard saw this truth with agonizing clarity. For him, silence was not merely a spiritual exercise or a poetic ideal. It was a necessary revolt against the noise of the crowd. In a time when the individual was already being swallowed by the collective voice of public opinion, Kierkegaard warned of a deepening danger, the loss of the self. He believed that truth could only be found in subjectivity, in the intimate, inward relationship between a person and their own existence. And silence was the atmosphere where that relationship could finally take root. In a noisy world, filled with posturing and performance, silence becomes the terrain of authenticity, not because it's peaceful, but because it strips away all illusion. In silence, you are no longer playing a role. You are simply, and sometimes painfully, yourself. But this is not always a comforting kind of silence. Kierkegaard's silence is often laced with dread, with the existential anxiety of confronting what lies beneath our carefully curated identities. He speaks of despair as the sickness unto death, a condition where the self either refuses to be itself or desperately wishes to be something it is not. The only way out of this despair, he suggests, is through inwardness. It is through turning away from the endless chatter of the world and listening to the deep, sometimes disturbing questions that arise in silence. Who am I, really? What am I called to become? Silence, then, becomes the crucible in which these questions are not just asked, but lived. And in living them, one suffers, yes, but one also begins, at last, to truly exist. In the Kierkegaardian sense, silence is not a withdrawal from life, but an entrance into its most profound dimensions. It is the refusal to be distracted by the crowd, to be defined by the gaze of others. It is the moment when the individual stands alone, not lonely, but singular before the awesome weight of freedom and the absolute necessity of choice. To be silent is not to disengage, but to assume full responsibility for one's own being. And this silence is not empty. It is filled with the tremors of becoming. It is the silence before a leap of faith, the moment when all external justifications and societal safety nets collapse, and the only thing left is a self-facing eternity. And this leap cannot be explained in words. It must be lived in silence. In a time when everyone has something to say, often loudly and instantly, Kierkegaard's silence is a kind of spiritual heresy. It is the decision not to perform for the algorithm, not to shout in order to be heard, not to exist only in reaction to others. It is a silence that resists the flattening of the soul by refusing to be available for public consumption. This silence is about depth. It's about becoming so inwardly alive that the surface chatter no longer matters. In this way, Kierkegaard gives us a model for a kind of spiritual defiance, a way of reclaiming ourselves from the noise, not through escape, but through radical inwardness. In silence, we meet not only ourselves, but something greater, a God who speaks not in thunder, but in stillness. The Trappist monk, Thomas Merton, a modern contemplative, understood this language of stillness perhaps better than anyone in the 20th century. He did not see silence as a withdrawal from the world, but as a doorway into its deeper truth. For him, silence was not emptiness, but listening a sacred receptivity. In a world already saturated with noise and opinion, Merton entered a monastery not to escape life, but to find it without the filters of ego and society. And what he discovered there was not the absence of the world, but its very essence. In silence, the soul is no longer fragmented and pulled in 1,000 directions by external demands. It is recollected. It is made whole. Merton believed that words, when used carelessly, often distract us from meaning, but silence, when embraced consciously, reveals it. The word is not more sacred than the silence. He wrote, because silence, unlike speech, does not impose. It waits. It does not seek to convince. It invites. And it is in that waiting, in that sacred invitation, that we begin to hear what cannot be spoken. Merton's silence was not an escape from responsibility. It was a deeper engagement with reality. He saw that the noise of modern life, both external and internal, blinds us not only to others, but to the divine that dwells within all things. We become trapped in what he called the tyranny of activity, always doing, achieving, responding, yet rarely simply being. Silence, then, becomes an act of resistance. Not because it's passive, but because it disrupts the machinery of distraction. It opens a space in which the soul can breathe, where true contemplation becomes possible. And in contemplation, Merton believed, we don't merely think, we see. We perceive the interconnectedness of all things, the hidden beauty that lies beneath the surface of routine, the still point in the turning world. Silence is not the absence of participation, it is the beginning of true understanding. To sit in silence, especially today, is to declare that you will not be owned by urgency, that you will not let the algorithms of the world dictate your value or your attention. Merton's life was a testimony to this quiet defiance. In the cloistered rhythms of monastic life, he discovered that stillness could be revolutionary, not in the way of protest signs or loud speeches, but in the radical shift it initiates within. The revolution Merton speaks of is not out there in the streets. It is in here, in the inner room, where no one else can enter. And when that room is finally quiet, what we meet is not an idea, but presence. Silence, for Merton, is the place where God is no longer a theory to be debated, but a living reality to be experienced, subtle, tender, and unsettlingly close. It is where the soul learns to hear again, not with ears, but with its very being. In a world obsessed with articulation, Merton teaches us to honor what cannot be said. His silence was not sterile, but luminous. It contained multitudes. It held sorrow and joy, doubt and devotion. And more than anything, it held space for mystery, for reverence, for transformation. To follow Merton's path is not to become silent in a superficial way, but to cultivate a silence that listens, that surrenders, that allows. A silence that is not the absence of voice, but the fullness of presence. It is a silence that protests the noise, not by opposing it, but by transcending it. And in that transcendence, we do not abandon the world. We return to it more awake, more compassionate, more real. Because the silence that Merton speaks of is not a retreat. It is a return to the heart of all things. In an age where everything seems to demand a reaction, where our thoughts, opinions, and voices are pushed to the forefront at every moment, silence can no longer be viewed merely as passive. It becomes a radical act of defiance. Choosing silence in a world that values noise above all else is a rejection of the system that profits from our attention, our outrage, and our constant engagement. This form of silence is not a withdrawal from the world, but a refusal to participate in its trivialities. It is, in essence, a contemplative civil disobedience. It is an active protest, not through words, but through stillness. When the world demands that we react, shout, and contribute to the endless cycle of opinion, silence becomes an assertion of self, an insistence on not being swept up in the frenzy of superficial engagement. This silence is not empty, it is filled with purpose. It is a deliberate act of choosing to listen instead of speak, to reflect instead of react, to observe instead of perform. In choosing silence, we refuse to be complicit in the noise that creates division, that escalates conflict, and that perpetuates the cycle of endless stimulation. This form of disobedience is subtle, but it is profoundly transformative. It says, "I will not give in to the pressure to perform for you. I will not contribute to the illusion that louder is better, that more opinions make for a better world." It challenges the notion that visibility and volume are the ultimate measures of worth. Silence, in this sense, is a way of saying, I will not allow myself to be reduced to a soundbite. I will not be manipulated by the need for constant validation. Choosing silence is also a way of resisting the constant pace of life that demands our immediate responses. In today's world, time has become a commodity to be used, consumed, and optimized. The constant pressure to stay connected, to be constantly on, leaves little room for reflection, for depth, or for contemplation. In choosing silence, we step outside the rush. We reclaim time not as a tool to be spent, but as a space to be experienced. Silence allows us to reclaim our own rhythm, not dictated by the external world, but by the internal world. It is a way of saying, I will not be governed by the clock. I will not allow the world's demands to determine my pace. Moreover, silence in this context is not about apathy or indifference to the suffering of the world. On the contrary, it is a deeper engagement. By resisting the noise and chaos of modern life, we create space within ourselves to truly hear, to listen, not just to others, but to the world itself, to its suffering and its beauty, to its contradictions and its truths. Silence allows us to approach the world not as a spectator, but as a participant in a way that is authentic, grounded, and connected. It is a form of civil disobedience because it refuses to be swept up in the narratives imposed by society. It allows us to hear more clearly what is really happening, what really matters, and what we are really being asked to do. And in that clarity, action becomes more powerful, more intentional, and more meaningful. In a time of endless noise and distractions, choosing silence is the ultimate revolutionary act. It is a way of rejecting the artificial urgency of modern life and returning to something deeper, something truer. Silence is not an absence, it is a presence. It is the presence of clarity, of intention, of awareness. It is the space where the self can breathe, where the soul can grow, where the world can be seen in its truest form. Choosing silence in a noisy world is not just an act of resistance, it is an act of creation. It is the creation of a space where the soul can awaken, where truth can emerge, and where the individual can finally stand free from the tyranny of the collective din.